The sound of hooves pounding against the dusty earth echoed through Rosalie Everett's mind as she stared at the empty cabin before her. Every stick of furniture gone, every memento vanished, only the bare walls remained. The note fluttered in her trembling hand, the words blurring through her tears. April 1878, in Rhyolite, Nevada Territory had brought nothing but heartache and betrayal. "He took everything," Rosalie whispered to the empty room, her voice bouncing off the barren walls. Her husband of 8 years, William, had sold their possessions, emptied their modest savings, and disappeared with a saloon girl half his age. The note, hastily scrawled, offered no real explanation, just empty words about needing freedom and a fresh start. At 26, Rosalie found herself with nothing but the dress on her back and the wedding ring she'd already slipped from her finger. She sank to the floor, her honey blonde hair falling around her face as sobs racked her body. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the cabin. She'd once called home a home that technically belonged to the mining company William had worked for. A knock at the door startled her from her grief. She hastily wiped her tears, though there was little point in hiding her distress. The entire town of Rhyolite would soon know of her abandonment. "Mrs. Everett?" The deep voice belonged to Mr. Henderson, the mine manager. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Rosalie stood, smoothing her skirts with dignity she didn't feel. "I assume you're here about the cabin," the older man nodded, twisting his hat in his hands. "Company policy, with William gone, you'll need to vacate by week's end." Another blow. Rosalie bit her lip to keep from crying out. 4 days to find somewhere to go, with no money and no family within 1,000 miles. "I understand," she managed, though she understood nothing about how her life had shattered so completely. After Henderson left, Rosalie gathered the few personal items William hadn't bothered to sell: her mother's Bible, a small silver hairbrush, and the photograph of her parents. Everything else was gone. The next morning, Rosalie walked into town with her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. Rhyolite had grown considerably since the silver discoveries, but it remained small enough for gossip to travel faster than wildfire. "Poor thing," she heard someone murmur. "Always knew that William was no good," another voice added. Rosalie pushed open the door to Harriet's dry goods, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "Rosalie," Harriet exclaimed, her round face creased with concern. "I heard what happened." "That no good husband of yours. I need work, Harriet," Rosalie interrupted, unable to bear sympathy. "Anything at all." The older woman's expression fell. "Oh, honey, I wish I could help, but business has been slow with the new store opening in Carson City. I can barely keep Sally on." Rosalie tried 3 more establishments, each with the same result. By midday, desperation had settled in her stomach like a stone. She paused outside the Silver Spur Saloon, considering for one wild moment whether they might need help. The thought of working alongside the type of woman William had left with made her stomach turn. As she stood there, contemplating her dwindling options, the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. A small group of riders was making their way down the main street, dust billowing behind them. They were trail-worn but sitting tall in their saddles, cattle drivers, by the look of them. The man in front rode a magnificent chestnut stallion. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered hat pulled low over his eyes. As the group passed, he tipped his hat slightly in Rosalie's direction, revealing a glimpse of intense blue eyes and a strong jawline shadowed by several days' growth of beard. Rosalie quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. She had more pressing concerns than handsome strangers. By sunset, Rosalie had exhausted every possibility in town. No one was hiring, and the few who might have taken pity on her were too afraid of potential scandal. A woman abandoned by her husband carried a certain stigma, deserved or not. She returned to the empty cabin and sat on the floor, back against the wall, contemplating her options. The stage coach to Carson City would cost money she didn't have. Walking was suicide with spring bandits roaming the territory. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. This time it was Sarah Miller, the preacher's wife. "I brought you some supper," Sarah said, handing over a basket. "And news. The cattle drivers who arrived today are looking for someone to cook for their outfit while they're in the area. It's just temporary, but..." Rosalie grabbed her friend's hands. "Where can I find them?" They've made camp just outside town. The trail boss is a man named Preston Callahan. He has a reputation as a fair man. Hope flickered to life in Rosalie's chest. Thank you, Sarah. The next morning, Rosalie walked the half-mile to the cattle camp, her heart pounding with each step. The men were already bustling about as dawn broke over the mountains. She hesitated at the edge of camp, suddenly aware of how she must look a lone woman approaching a camp of trail-hardened men. "Can I help you, madam?" A young cowhand had spotted her, his expression curious. "I'm looking for Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The young man pointed toward a figure by the chuck wagon. "That's the boss there." Rosalie approached the tall man she'd seen riding into town. Up close, he was even more imposing, at least 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now as he studied a map spread on a crate. "Mr. Callahan?" she ventured. He looked up, those striking blue eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Madam." He straightened, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with a touch of silver at the temples. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps mid-30s. "My name is Rosalie Everett. I heard you might need someone to cook for your outfit." His gaze was appraising but not unkind. "You heard right. Our cook broke his leg 2 days back, had to leave him in Tanapa." He tilted his head. "You know how to cook for 15 hungry men, Mrs. Everett?" "I do," she said with more confidence than she felt, "and I'm a hard worker." "Where's your husband feel about you riding with a cattle outfit?" The question stung, but Rosalie kept her composure. "I don't have one. Not anymore." Understanding dawned in his eyes, but to his credit, he asked no further questions about her personal situation. "Pay is $20 for the job, plus meals. We'll be working this territory for about 3 weeks, moving the herd between grazing lands." It wasn't much, but it would buy her time to figure out what to do next. "When do I start?" she asked. "Now, if you're ready." He gestured to the chuck wagon. "Rusty can show you what supplies we have." An hour later, Rosalie was elbow-deep in breakfast preparations, trying to ignore the curious glances from the cowboys. The elderly man called Rusty hovered nearby, offering occasional advice about the men's preferences. "Boss likes his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in," he informed her. "And young Billy over there will eat his weight in biscuits if you let him." By the time she rang the triangle to signal breakfast was ready, Rosalie was sweating despite the cool morning air. The men lined up politely, each tipping their hat and thanking her as she filled their plates with eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Preston Callahan came last, his expression unreadable as he accepted his plate. "Smells good, Mrs. Everett." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." She watched anxiously as he took his first bite, relaxing only when he nodded in approval. The day passed in a blur of work. After breakfast, the men rode out to begin gathering scattered cattle, leaving Rosalie to clean up, prepare lunch, and start dinner preparations. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones, but she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in years. As the men returned, dusty and tired, Preston approached the chuck wagon. "You did well today," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of approval. "The men are pleased." "Thank you." Rosalie stirred the pot of stew, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "I heard in town that you're having to leave your place," he said, his tone careful. "Mining company cabin." Rosalie stiffened. "Word travels fast. Small towns always do." He leaned against the wagon. "Where will you go?" "I haven't decided yet." She kept her eyes on the stew. "I have until the end of the week to figure it out." Preston was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "You'll have a home before the week ends, Mrs. Everett, I promise you that." Rosalie looked up, startled by both his words and the conviction behind them. "Mr. Callahan, Preston," he corrected gently, "and I don't make promises I can't keep." Before she could respond, he walked away, leaving her bewildered. What could he possibly mean? The next morning, Rosalie woke before dawn in the small tent the men had set up for her privacy. She dressed quickly and made her way to the chuck wagon, determined to have coffee ready before the cowboys stirred. To her surprise, Preston was already up, building the fire. "You're up early," she remarked, reaching for the coffee pot. "Always am." He straightened, dusting his hands on his pants. "Wanted to talk to you before the men wake up." Rosalie's stomach tightened with anxiety. Had she done something wrong? I rode into town last night, he continued. Spoke to Henderson at the mining company. Oh, she busied herself with the coffee, afraid to meet his eyes. I've purchased a parcel of land just south of town. Good water access, decent grazing. There's a small cabin that needs work, but it's sound. Rosalie's hands stilled. Why are you telling me this? Preston stepped closer, his expression earnest. Because I'm offering you a place to stay, Rosalie. No strings attached. The cabin needs a caretaker while I'm on the trail, and you need somewhere to go. She stared at him, searching for deceit or ulterior motives, but found only sincerity in those blue eyes. Why would you do that for a stranger? She whispered. A shadow passed over his face. Because 8 years ago, my sister found herself in a situation similar to yours. No one helped her. He looked away briefly. She didn't survive the winter. Rosalie's heart ached at the pain in his voice. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just consider my offer. He handed her a folded paper. This is the deed. I've had Henderson draw up a caretaker agreement. You can stay as long as you need in exchange for maintaining the place. Stunned, Rosalie took the paper with trembling fingers. I don't know what to say. Say you'll look at the cabin before deciding. A hint of a smile softened his features. We can ride out there after breakfast. True to his word, Preston saddled 2 horses after the morning meal and led Rosalie south of town. The ride took nearly an hour, during which they spoke little. Rosalie was still processing the unexpected offer, while Preston seemed content with the silence. When they crested a small hill, the cabin came into view. It was situated in a grove of cottonwoods near a clear stream, with rolling hills beyond that would indeed provide good grazing. The structure itself was modest, a single-room cabin with a small porch, but it appeared solid if weathered. It belonged to an old prospector, Preston explained as they dismounted. No family to claim it when he passed last year. Rosalie approached the cabin slowly. The door creaked as Preston pushed it open, revealing a dusty but surprisingly cozy interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on 3 sides would provide ample light. It needs cleaning, she observed, running a finger along a dusty shelf. And repairs, Preston agreed, but the roof is sound and the well water is sweet. Rosalie walked the small space, mentally arranging furniture that didn't exist. After the emptiness of her former home, even this dusty cabin felt like possibility. There's a vegetable garden plot out back, Preston continued, watching her carefully. Gone wild now, but good soil. She turned to face him, overwhelmed by his generosity. Why don't you live here yourself? A sad smile crossed his face. The trail is my home, Mrs. Everett, has been for 15 years. Please call me Rosalie, she said softly, and thank you, I accept your offer. Relief washed over his features. Good, we can bring your things tomorrow. That won't take long, she said with a hollow laugh. Everything I own fits in a single carpet bag. Something flickered in Preston's eyes, anger perhaps, though not directed at her. We'll need to get you some basics. Bed, table, cookware. I can't afford, consider it part of the caretaking arrangement, he interrupted gently. Can't maintain a home without proper tools. Rosalie wanted to protest, but found herself nodding instead. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. They rode back to the cattle camp in companionable silence, the weight on Rosalie's shoulders lighter than it had been in days. She had a direction now, a place to go. That evening, after the men had eaten, Preston gathered them around the fire. We'll be moving the herd to the south pasture tomorrow, he announced. And we'll be helping Mrs. Everett get settled in the old Miller cabin on our way. The cowboys exchanged glances, but no one questioned the boss's decision. Means an early start, Preston continued. And I'll need a couple of volunteers to ride into town for supplies. Several hands went up, and Preston selected 2 of the older hands for the task. Later, as Rosalie was cleaning up, a young cowboy named Billy approached her shyly. Madam, I'm pretty handy with carpentry. Boss said the cabin might need some fixing up. I'd be happy to help. Touched by the offer, Rosalie smiled. Thank you, Billy, that's very kind. We all want to help, madam, he said, scuffing his boot in the dirt. Boss says you've had a rough go of it. Word had spread then. But rather than the judgment she'd feared, these men were offering kindness. It was almost too much to bear. The next morning, the cattle drive moved south, with a wagon carrying Rosalie's few possessions and the supplies Preston had arranged. By midday, they reached the cabin, and the men set to work with surprising efficiency. Some cleared the overgrown yard, others repaired loose boards and a sagging step, while Preston and Billy assembled the simple furniture that had been purchased. Rosalie worked alongside them, scrubbing floors and windows until the cabin began to look like a home. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. A bed stood in one corner with fresh linens, a small table with 2 chairs occupied another, and the fireplace crackled with a welcoming blaze. The men tipped their hats as they prepared to leave, each offering good wishes. Preston was the last to go, lingering on the porch as twilight descended. "Will you be all right here?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Rosalie nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "Thanks to you. We'll be camped about 3 miles south for the next few days. If you need anything, I'll be fine," she assured him, then added softly, "You kept your promise. A home before the week's end." In the fading light, she could see his smile, gentle and genuine. "Rest well, Rosalie." As he rode away, Rosalie stood on the porch of her new home, watching until he disappeared into the gathering darkness. For the first time since finding William's note, she felt something like hope unfurling in her chest. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Rosalie settled into her new home. She tackled the wild garden, salvaging what plants she could and clearing space for new ones. Preston had been generous with provisions, leaving her with enough flour, sugar, coffee, and preserved foods to last several weeks. On the 3rd day, Billy and another young cowboy appeared with a gift: 6 laying hens and a small coop they'd constructed. "Boss's idea," Billy explained, helping to settle the chickens in their new home. "Said every homestead needs fresh eggs." Rosalie's throat tightened at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Please thank him for me." "You can thank him yourself," Billy said with a grin. "He's invited you to dinner at the camp tonight, sent me to ask proper-like and to escort you if you're willing." The invitation surprised her, but Rosalie found herself looking forward to seeing Preston again. She changed into her best dress, one of only 2 she owned, and pinned her hair more carefully than usual, before allowing Billy to help her onto his 2nd horse for the ride to camp. The cowboys greeted her arrival with respectful nods and warm smiles. Preston stepped forward to help her dismount, his strong hands at her waist sending an unexpected flutter through her stomach. "You look well," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with appreciation. "The cabin agrees with you." "It does," she agreed. "Thank you for the chickens." "They're already settling in," he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I hoped you'd like them. Come, dinner's nearly ready." To Rosalie's surprise, she wasn't expected to cook. Instead, an older cowboy named Joseph had taken over the chuck wagon duties, producing a stew that rivaled her own. The men included her in their conversation easily, sharing stories and jokes that made her laugh for the first time in weeks. As the evening wore on, Preston sat beside her, his deep voice recounting tales of cattle drives and the landscapes he'd seen. Rosalie found herself captivated, not just by the stories but by the man himself, his quiet strength, his consideration for his men, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. When it came time to leave, Preston insisted on escorting her home himself. "The men will move the herd further south tomorrow," he told her as they rode side by side under a canopy of stars. "We'll be gone about 10 days. Disappointment settled in Rosalie's chest, stronger than she would have expected. "I see. Will you be all right on your own that long?" "Of course," she assured him, though the prospect of solitude suddenly seemed less appealing than it had before. "I have plenty to keep me busy." They reached the cabin too soon. Preston helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I left something for you," he said, nodding toward the porch. Curious, Rosalie turned to find a wooden crate sitting by the door. Inside was a collection of books, novels, poetry, a farming almanac, and a journal with a leather cover. "Preston," she breathed, running her fingers over the volumes, "this is too much." "Everyone needs stories," he said simply, "and I thought you might like to write your own." She looked up at him, moonlight silvering his features. "Thank you for everything." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Good night, Rosalie." As promised, the cattle drive moved on the next day. Rosalie threw herself into work, determined to make the cabin and land truly her own. She cleared more of the garden, planted seeds Preston had provided, and began exploring the surrounding area. The solitude, which she had initially welcomed, began to weigh on her as days passed. She found herself watching the southern horizon, hoping for riders that didn't appear. At night, she read from Preston's books, losing herself in stories of adventure and romance, and wrote in the journal, pouring out thoughts she couldn't share with anyone else. On the seventh day, a rider appeared, but it wasn't Preston. It was Billy, his young face serious as he dismounted. "Mrs. Everett," he greeted her. "Boss sent me to check on you and to warn you there's been trouble." Alarm shot through her. What kind of trouble? Rustlers hit a ranch about 20 miles south, stole cattle and burned the place. Billy twisted his hat in his hands. "Boss is worried they might be moving this way." "Has he sent word to the sheriff?" Billy nodded. "But the sheriff's up in Carson City for a trial, deputies gathering men, but—" He trailed off. Rosalie understood the unspoken concern. Remote homesteads were vulnerable. "Is there somewhere you could go?" Billy asked. "Maybe into town until this blows over." Rosalie thought of Rhyolite, of the whispers and pitying glances. "No," she said firmly. "This is my home now. I won't be driven from it." Billy looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Boss figured you'd say that. He sent this." He handed her a revolver carefully wrapped in cloth, said you should keep it close. Rosalie took the weapon, feeling its weight in her palm. William had never allowed her to handle firearms, claiming women had no business with such things. Do you know how to use it?" Billy asked hesitantly. "My father taught me," she said, checking that it was loaded. It had been years, but the knowledge returned quickly. "Tell Preston I appreciate his concern, but I'll be fine." After Billy left, Rosalie moved through the cabin with new awareness, checking windows and the single door. She placed the revolver on the table beside her bed and slept fitfully, waking at every sound. 2 more days passed without incident. Rosalie began to hope the danger had passed when the sound of approaching horses jolted her from sleep well before dawn. Multiple riders moving fast. Heart pounding, she grabbed the revolver and moved to the window, staying to the side as her father had taught her. In the pre-dawn light, she could make out 3 riders approaching the cabin. They weren't cowboys, their movements were furtive, their faces obscured, rustlers, or worse. Rosalie's hand tightened on the gun. She could shoot if necessary, but 3 against 1 were poor odds. As the men dismounted and approached the cabin, she made a swift decision, slipping out the back door and into the chicken coop. From her hiding place, she watched as the men forced the cabin door open and disappeared inside. The sounds of destruction reached her, furniture being overturned, glass breaking. When they emerged, one was carrying her few provisions, another her mother's Bible. Rage replaced fear. These men weren't just thieves, they were taking the little she had managed to rebuild. Without conscious thought, she stepped from the coop, revolver raised. "Put those down," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The men froze, then the largest, clearly the leader, let out a laugh. "Well, look at this. Little lady's got herself a gun. And I know how to use it," Rosalie replied coldly. "Drop my belongings and leave." The leader took a step toward her, his smile cruel. "I don't think you've got the nerve to pull that trigger, sweetheart." Rosalie aimed at the ground near his feet and fired. The report echoed in the dawn stillness, and the man jumped back with a curse. "Next one won't miss," she warned, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The 3 men exchanged glances. They were reassessing, but she could see they weren't ready to retreat. She was outnumbered, and they knew it. Just as the leader reached for his own weapon, the thunder of hooves broke the tense silence. All 4 of them turned to see riders approaching fast, at least a dozen, with Preston Callahan in the lead, his expression terrible in its fury. The rustlers scrambled for their horses, but they were too late. Preston's men surrounded them, guns drawn. The fight went out of the thieves instantly. "You all right?" Preston was at Rosalie's side, his eyes scanning her for injuries. She nodded, suddenly aware she was standing in her nightdress with a revolver in her hand. "They didn't hurt me, just broke some things." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "Billy told me you refused to leave." Stubborn woman. Despite everything, Rosalie found herself smiling. "You're one to talk. How did you know to come?" "We were already on our way back when we ran into a man who'd escaped these vermin." He glared at the captured rustlers. "Said they were heading this way next." His jaw tightened. "I pushed the men hard all night to get here." While Preston's men secured the rustlers, he insisted on checking Rosalie for injuries himself, his large hands gentle as they turned her arms, examining a scrape she'd gotten climbing into the chicken coop. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I wasn't," she reminded him, "thanks to your warning and this." She handed him back the revolver. He shook his head, closing her fingers around it. "Keep it. Seems you know how to use it well enough." They walked into the cabin together, surveying the damage. It wasn't as bad as it could have been: some broken dishes, upturned furniture, a shattered window, nothing that couldn't be repaired. "I'll have the men help clean up," Preston offered, but Rosalie shook her head. "No need, I can manage." She straightened her shoulders. "This is my home, I'll take care of it." Something shifted in Preston's expression, respect, perhaps, mixed with something warmer. "At least let me fix that window before we take these vermin to the sheriff." As the morning progressed, Preston worked alongside Rosalie to restore order to the cabin. His men guarded the rustlers while making repairs to the damaged porch and window. By noon, things were largely back to normal. "We need to get these men to town," Preston said reluctantly. "The deputy will want statements." Rosalie nodded, suddenly not wanting him to leave. "Of course." He hesitated, then added, "I'd feel better if you came with us, just until we're sure there aren't more of them around." The concern in his voice warmed her. "All right, let me change first." The ride to Rhyolite was tense, with the captured rustlers bound and sullen. Rosalie rode beside Preston, acutely aware of his protective presence. When they reached town, the deputy was waiting, alerted by one of Preston's men who had ridden ahead. "Mrs. Everett," Deputy Collins greeted her with surprise. "Heard you left town." "I found a place south of here," she replied, lifting her chin against the curious stares of townspeople gathering to see the commotion. The deputy's eyes moved between her and Preston, clearly making assumptions. "I see." "Mrs. Everett is caretaking my property," Preston said firmly, dismounting and helping Rosalie down. "And she showed remarkable courage this morning when these men attempted to rob and possibly harm her." The deputy's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "I'll need statements from both of you." The formalities took hours, during which Rosalie endured the whispers and stares of her former neighbors. Preston stayed close, his steady presence a comfort as she recounted the morning's events. By late afternoon, they were free to go. As they left the deputy's office, Harriet from the dry goods store approached, her expression apologetic. "Rosalie, dear, I heard what happened. Are you truly all right?" "I am, thank you, Harriet." The older woman glanced at Preston, then back to Rosalie. "That is, if you're looking for work still, I find I could use help after all." Rosalie understood immediately. Now that she had a respectable connection to Preston Callahan, the town's opinion of her had shifted. The same people who had turned her away now viewed her differently. "Thank you, Harriet," she said evenly, "but I have work at my new home. Good day." As they walked to their horses, Preston's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back. "That was well handled. People are fickle," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Yes," he agreed simply. "Ready to go home, home." The word settled in Rosalie's chest like a warm ember. Yes, the ride back was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the cabin, the setting sun bathed it in golden light, making it look almost enchanted. "I should check the herd," Preston said as they dismounted. "We left them in the south pasture with only a few men watching." Disappointment flickered through Rosalie. "Of course." He turned to her, his expression earnest. "I'll be back tomorrow if that's all right, to make sure you're settled." "I'd like that," she admitted. His smile was gentle as he mounted his horse. "Until tomorrow, then." True to his word, Preston returned the next day and the next. Each visit brought small gift seeds for the garden, a mended pot, fresh meat from a deer one of his men had shot. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side on small improvements to the cabin and land. Rosalie found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. After William's betrayal, she had sworn never to trust a man again. Yet Preston was different: his quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. 2 weeks after the rustler incident, Preston arrived with a special delivery, a small rowboat. "The stream widens about half a mile east," he explained as they carried it to the water. "Thought you might enjoy fishing or just floating on a warm day." Rosalie trailed her fingers in the cool water as Preston rowed them along the stream, marveling at how peaceful it felt. The land around them was coming alive with spring, wildflowers dotting the banks and birds calling from the trees. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "I never thought I'd feel at home again after your husband left," Preston finished when she trailed off. She nodded, surprising herself by adding, "He sold everything we owned, even my mother's china and my grandmother's quilt, said I was boring, that I was holding him back." The admission hurt less than it once had. Preston's hands tightened on the oars. "Some men don't recognize the value of what they have until it's gone. And some never do," she said, thinking of William's casual cruelty over their years together. Preston studied her face, his blue eyes serious. "You deserve better, Rosalie." Something in his tone made her breath catch. "I'm learning that," she whispered. When they returned to the cabin, Preston built a fire while Rosalie prepared a simple dinner. They ate on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "My men are moving on day after tomorrow," Preston said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Taking the herd to the railhead at Carson City." Rosalie's heart sank. "Oh, will you be gone long?" "About 3 weeks." He set his plate aside. Unless. He turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Unless I stay." Rosalie stared at him, hardly daring to understand his meaning. "Your work, my foreman can handle the delivery." Preston took a deep breath. "Rosalie, these past weeks, being here with you. It's the first time in 15 years I've felt like I might want more than the trail." Hope bloomed in her chest, fragile but insistent. "What are you saying, Preston?" He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm saying I care for you. More than I thought possible after such a short time." His eyes held hers, vulnerable yet determined. "I'm asking if you might feel the same." Rosalie's throat tightened with emotion. "I do," she admitted softly, "but I'm afraid, after William, I'm not him," Preston said fiercely. "I would never betray your trust that way. I know." And she did know, with a certainty that surprised her. In the weeks she'd known him, Preston had shown his character in countless ways: his kindness to his men, his generosity to her, his unfailing honesty. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, questioning, but as Preston's arms came around her, it deepened into something more: a promise, a beginning. When they finally drew apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I'll stay," he whispered. "If you'll have me." "I'll have you," Rosalie answered, her heart full. The weeks that followed were the happiest Rosalie could remember. Preston sent his men on to Carson City with the cattle while he remained at the cabin. Together, they expanded the garden, repaired the roof, and built a small stable for his horse and the mule he purchased to pull a wagon. Word spread through Rhyolite that Preston Callahan, respected trail boss, had settled down with the woman whose husband had abandoned her. Some whispered, but most welcomed the news. Preston was well regarded, and his obvious devotion to Rosalie silenced all but the most determined gossips. As spring gave way to summer, their relationship deepened. Preston was patient, never pushing for more than Rosalie was ready to give. They spent evenings on the porch, talking about their pasts, their hopes, the future they might build together. One warm July evening, as they sat watching fireflies dance over the stream, Preston turned to her with serious eyes. "I've been thinking," he began, taking her hand in his. "This cabin is good, but it's small. If we're to have a proper ranch, we'll need something bigger." Rosalie's heart quickened. "A proper ranch," he nodded, suddenly looking nervous. "I've drawn up plans: 2 bedrooms, a bigger kitchen, a proper parlor." He hesitated. "Room for a family if you wanted that someday." "Preston," she breathed, understanding dawning, "are you asking?" He slid from the porch step to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Rosalie Everett, I love you. Will you marry me and build a life here together?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as joy burst through her chest. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." They were married in August, a simple ceremony in the meadow near their cabin. Rosalie wore a new dress of pale blue with wildflowers in her hair. Preston's Cowboys returned from their circuit to stand as witnesses, along with Sarah Miller and a few other friends from town. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of twisted willow branches, Rosalie marveled at how much had changed in just a few months. From the depths of despair to this moment of perfect happiness, It seemed almost miraculous. "I promise to cherish and protect you all the days of my life," Preston said, his voice steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. "And I promise to stand by your side through whatever comes," Rosalie replied, placing a matching ring on his hand. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music from a cowboy's fiddle and food prepared by Rosalie and Sarah. As dusk fell, Preston led his bride in a dance beneath the stars, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Later that night, alone in their cabin, Rosalie discovered new depths to her happiness as Preston loved her with tenderness and passion that healed the last of her wounded heart. In his arms, she found not just pleasure but a sense of belonging she'd never known before. The following year brought changes to their lives. True to his word, Preston began construction on a larger home closer to the stream. The ranch, which they named Cottonwood Creek, grew as Preston purchased additional cattle and hired 2 permanent hands to help work the land. Rosalie's garden flourished, producing more than they could eat. She began selling vegetables and preserves in town, establishing a small but profitable business. The townsfolk who had once whispered behind her back now greeted her warmly, though Rosalie never forgot who had stood by her in her darkest hour and who had not. In late spring, as they moved into their new home, Rosalie shared news that brought tears to Preston's eyes. They were expecting a child. "A family," he whispered, holding her close, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our family." The pregnancy was difficult at times, with morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon and fatigue that sometimes left Rosalie unable to do more than rest. Preston fussed over her constantly, insisting on hiring a woman from town to help with housekeeping and cooking. "You're doing the most important work already," he told her when she protested. "Growing our child." Their son, James William Callahan, was born on a snowy December night. He had Preston's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair that soon fell out and grew back honey blonde like his mother's. From the moment the midwife placed him in Preston's arms, the tough cowboy was utterly smitten. "He's perfect," Preston declared, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his mother." Life settled into a new rhythm with James at its center. The days were full and sometimes exhausting, but Rosalie had never been happier. She watched Preston transform from trail boss to devoted father, teaching James to ride almost before he could walk, telling him stories of cattle drives and adventures on the range. As James grew, so did Cottonwood Creek Ranch. Preston's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread, bringing buyers from as far as San Francisco. They were able to hire more help, allowing Preston to spend less time on the trail and more with his family. On James's 3rd birthday, Rosalie shared news of another child on the way. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and the following summer, their daughter Elizabeth Sarah Callahan joined the family, a blue-eyed, strong-willed girl who wrapped her father around her tiny finger from day one. "She's going to be just like you," Preston predicted as they watched her determinedly trying to keep up with her brother. "Heaven help us all," Rosalie laughed, leaning into her husband's embrace. The years passed with the changing seasons, each bringing new joys and occasional sorrows. They lost Sarah Miller to pneumonia one harsh winter, and the following spring, word came that William Everett had died in a saloon fight in California. Rosalie felt nothing but a distant pity for the man who had once been her husband. Through it all, Preston remained her rock, his love unwavering. Each night, no matter how busy the day had been, they found time to sit together on the porch, watching the stars and talking about their day. On their 10th anniversary, Preston surprised her with a special gift, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of James and Elizabeth, with room for more. "For the family we've built," he said, fastening it around her neck, "and for the one we're still building." Rosalie touched the locket, then reached for his hand, placing it over her stomach with a smile. "Sooner than you think." Preston's eyes widened. Again, she nodded, laughing at his expression. "Again." He gathered her into his arms, spinning her in a circle before setting her down with exaggerated care. "I love you, Rosalie Callahan, more every day, and I love you," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. My cowboy who gave me a home when I had nothing and everything else since. Their third child, a son they named Thomas Preston, arrived that winter, a quiet, thoughtful boy who preferred books to horses but had his father's kind heart. As the children grew, so did the ranch and their happiness. The difficult beginnings of their story faded into the background, though Rosalie never forgot how close she had come to losing everything and how one man's promise had changed the course of her life. 15 years to the day after Preston had told her, "You'll have a home before the week ends," Rosalie stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching her husband teaching their youngest son to rope a fence post. James, now a tall young man of 16, was riding the range with the hands, while Elizabeth sat nearby, sketching the scene with remarkable skill for a 13-year-old. Their home was filled with love, laughter, and occasionally chaos. The land that had once seemed so empty now teemed with live cattle grazing on the hillsides, chickens scratching in the yard, 3 dogs sleeping in the shade. Preston looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after all these years, his smile still made her heart skip a beat. He excused himself from Thomas and walked toward her, his stride as confident as the day they'd met. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked, climbing the steps to join her. Rosalie slipped her arm around his waist, leaning into his solid strength. "I was thinking about promises kept." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice soft with memory. "You'll have a home before the week ends. The best promise anyone ever made to me," she murmured. Preston turned her to face him, his eyes as blue and honest as they'd been that day by the chuck wagon. "And I'm still keeping it, every day." Rosalie reached up to touch his face, weathered now with years of sun and wind, but still the most beloved face in her world. "So am I." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in familiar hues of gold and crimson, Preston and Rosalie Callahan stood together on the porch of the home they'd built, not just the house and ranch, but the life they'd created from the ashes of betrayal and loss. A life of love, trust, and promises kept day after day, year after year. And as darkness fell and stars appeared one by one in the vast Nevada sky, they knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future might hold, they would face it together, just as they had from the moment a heartbroken woman with nothing left to lose had met a cowboy with a promise to keep.